Y'all familiar with CISA, right? The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency? Well, a contractor for the very agency that literally tells everyone else how to lock down their systems left a public GitHub repo wide open with credentials to multiple highly privileged AWS GovCloud accounts. Yeah, all the way up until this last weekend. Yeah, you heard me right, folks. The Cybersecurity Agency leaked the keys to its own cloud kingdom. Here's what happened. So, GovCloud is the isolated AWS region built specifically for federal workloads. This is the place where sensitive government data is supposed to live behind a bunch of extra walls of security. Anyways, a admin level contractor pushed a repo to public GitHub that contained access keys, configuration files, and internal documentation showing how CISA builds, tests, and ships its software. Think about it. We're talking about things like deployment pipelines, infrastructure layouts, and a roadmap of all the internal systems all sitting right next to working credentials. You know, just the sort of stuff threat actors would love to put to good use, right? So why am I personally getting my undies in a bunch over this? It's because the privileged GovCloud keys aren't just any credentials, folks. Depending on the permissions, an attacker could read data, maybe even spin up resources, or pivot into connected systems, or just quietly persist inside these federal cloud accounts. Yeah, pair that with internal build documentation, and you've handed somebody a guided tour of how to compromise the agency from the inside out. Yeah, security researchers that have reviewed this archive have called this, quote, one of the worst government leaks in recent memory. And it's not because of the volume. It's really because of what those files can enable, okay? The last update that we've heard was CISA pulled the repo down and presumably rotated all the exposed keys, which is a good call. But beyond that, the agency has been very tight-lipped on the scope, the timeline, and whether any data exfiltration occurred due to this critical mistake. All right, moving on to our next story. GitHub is investigating a claimed breach by the threat actor TeamPCP, who's advertising around 4,000 of GitHub's internal repositories for sale on a cybercrime forum. Yeah, that's right, folks. You heard it here. The world's largest source code host might have had its own source code stolen. Yeah, here's what's being claimed so far. TeamPCP, it's a name that's popped up several times this year in high-profile extortion cases, listed what they describe as GitHub's internal repos and internal organizations on a Russian-speaking forum. GitHub confirmed Tuesday it's looking into unauthorized access and said so far there's no evidence customer data stored outside its internal repositories is affected. That hedge is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Anyways, internal repositories at a company like GitHub aren't just product source code, okay? It's way worse than that. They typically contain build pipelines, infrastructure as code, secret scanning rules, other things like authentication logic, internal tooling, and sometimes credentials that should have never been committed to code but, are inevitably out there, right? Now, if TeamPCP has actually 4,000 of these repos, the blast radius isn't going to be just GitHub, okay? It's every customer whose security depends on assumptions about how GitHub's back end works. Yeah, the evidence so far is the forum listing itself plus GitHub's confirmation that it's investigating. Yeah. TeamPCP has a track record here too. They've been tied to data theft campaigns hitting Snowflake customers and several SaaS providers, and they don't typically post claims without something to back them up either. Yeah, asking price and proof samples haven't really been publicly verified yet though, okay? So we're still waiting for that. But what's next really depends entirely on what's actually in those repos, okay? If it's mostly stale internal tooling, this is going to fade away, okay? If it's signing keys, OAuth flows, or anything tied to how GitHub Actions authenticates or into customer environments, we're looking at a supply chain problem that touches a huge slice of the software industry, okay? So it could go one way or another. So if you run anything on GitHub, now's really a good time to audit your personal access tokens, rotate anything sensitive, and review which third-party actions you actually trust. All right, Last story of the day, folks. Lazarus Group's Dackle's Rat has landed on Mac OS, and Mac users who thought they were sitting safe from the North Korean malware, well, they just lost some of that comfort. Yes, this is a full remote access Trojan with plug-in architecture, command and control over TLS, and the kind of polish you'd expect from a crew that's been doing this for over a decade. So here's what's happening, okay? Dackles was originally a Linux and Windows tool tracked by researchers for years, okay? The Mac variant showed up disguised as a Trojan two-factor authentication app called Mina OTP. Once a user runs it, the malware drops a hidden working directory, installs a launch daemon for persistence, and then starts beaconing out to the operators. The capabilities of this tool are actually really broad. We're talking about file upload and download, command execution, and full system file browser. It also does process scanning and configuration updates pushed live from the C2. It also loads plugins on demand, so operators can actually extend the functionality even after they get an initial foothold. I should also mention the config file is encrypted with AES. The network traffic, it's wrapped up in TLS, and certificate pinning is built in. This is not sloppy work, folks. This is some pro-level stuff. Now, are you affected? Well, maybe. Anyone running Mac OS who installs a poison build of what looks like a legitimate 2FA tool might be affected here. Targeting has typically been crypto exchanges, financial firms, and defense-adjacent researchers. But a Mac rat this capable can be repurposed and reused very, very fast. There's no vendor here to hold accountable either, right? Lazarus doesn't issue statements. Apple's notarization didn't catch this variant because the sample wasn't signed through the official pipeline, which means users had to bypass Gatekeeper to run it. That's the failure point. What you should do is don't run unsigned binaries, even ones that look like they're familiar open source tools. You want to check for a launch daemon at the /library/launch daemons that you didn't install. Also, run a reputable Mac security tool, okay? And if you handle crypto keys or sensitive credentials on a Mac, assume you're going to be a target, okay? So with that said, this is today's stories. This is Andy Thompson signing off.